Good morning, everybody. Happy Monday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of things happening here and around the world. So a bunch of new polls came out, none of them really very good for Democrats. So we'll take a look at the shifts there and what exactly is going on. We're also going to speak to Senator Nina Turner. She is going to talk to us about that Obama lecture to black men.
This is wild.
She has a lot of thoughts, so excited to talk to her about that. And also, Dems are cutting an ad against Jill Stein and other third-party candidates. That's a first, and I think it displays their nervousness about how much Jill Stein in particular could cut into their vote totals, probably in states like Michigan. So we're also going to ask Nina Turner about that. Apparently, Trump is saying that he is going to go on Joe Rogan's podcast. Rogan had in the past resisted having the former president on. Perhaps that may be changing, so we'll talk about that in the broader context of what people are deeming now the podcast election. A lot of very troubling news coming out of Israel and Gaza in particular. There was a horrific strike by Israel on a hospital. A tent city there for displaced people caught fire. There are just unimaginably awful images of patients strapped to IVs who are being burned alive. So we will brace yourself for that one, but we'll talk about that. Also, Hezbollah struck an Israeli military base, and there were some significant number of casualties there. That's quite significant as well. We're taking a look at, on a much lighter note, Gretchen Whitmer apologizing after filming a really weird video. Show you that. And I'm taking a look at Elon's impact on this election, which may actually be unprecedented given the fact that Trump is saying is giving him $500 million, so $500 million. And obviously he's running an entire social media platform for his benefit. He's effectively running the Trump campaign in Pennsylvania, which is the most critical swing state. So we'll take a look at all of those things.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. Before we get to that, thank you to everybody who's been signing up at breakingpoints.com, premium subscribers. Remember, we have that exclusive election content with our forecaster, Logan. He will be on the show tomorrow, so you're going to take some behind-the-scenes look. I found his analysis so helpful. This guy is so in the weeds, and we also will be dropping exclusive election content as we get closer to Election Day. How long is it? 22 days, I think, today?
It is.
There you go.
Really
3
close.
weeks in one. So we're getting down to the wire. Pretty close to the time change, too. Excited for that. Right before Election Day, so we get two double whammies. But go ahead and sign up, breakingpoints.com. You'll be able to take a look at our maps. We'll just say, our maps were quite accurate last time, so there you go.
Yours more so than mine. Got to give you credit for that.
It's funny. I called every state in the election. I thought I would get more credit for it, and it ended up, though, because of Stop the Steal, Republicans were like, no, your map is
map is wrong.
Yeah, I did call every state in the election. I did mistakenly click Maine wrong, so it doesn't look right. But in the spirit
devastating
of it,
error.
it was off by 1%. I apologize. But yeah, so we'll see. You want to go ahead and sign up? You can take a look at that. We'll reveal them a couple of days before Election Day. We'll all talk about it and stuff like that. So let's go ahead and start with the polls. As you said, things really not looking good for Kamala Harris and the Democrats right now. Let's put this up there right now. 3 national polls dropped yesterday morning. ABC Ipsos, Harris was up 50-48. CBS News YouGov, Harris was up 51-48. NBC News 48-48, tied. All 3 had their last polls in September. So listen to this. ABC in September, Harris was up by 6, now only up by 2. NBC, Harris was up by 4, up now by 3. And NBC, probably the biggest drop, had Harris up by 5 at that time, now having the race tied. So keep in mind, not only are all of these polls within the margin of error, but most importantly, 2 or 3 points in the national popular vote is just not going to cut 3, maybe, but 2 almost certainly not. You guys can go ahead and take a look at Nate Silver's popular vote analysis for yourself if you're interested, but none of those are comfortable enough territory for Kamala Harris. And when we start to break down where the change and all of that is coming from and some of the movement on the economy, that's probably the most important. Steve Kornacki at NBC News breaking this down. Let's take a listen.
She's the VP in an unpopular administration. Look, we asked Joe Biden's policies as president. Do you think they're helping or hurting your family? Look at that. Almost 2-to-1 say hurting more than helping. His job approval rating is in the low 40s. And then here's the twist. When you ask folks, when Trump was president, were his policies helping or hurting? Look at that difference. 44% say helping, 31% say they hurt.
So there you go. Points on the economy. A lot of the are hurting my family, what people think about whether Trump administration policy helped their family, up by a 13-point margin. Trump really is, he is in such a unique political position where he was the president. People could see him in that job. He wasn't that president. He was president not that long ago.
Right.
And so you have the direct contrast, and you have not the incumbent like we had with Biden, but you have a relative incumbency with the vice president. And that is why I just go back to that moment from The View, Krystal, where she said nothing in particular that I can think of, except, sorry, I would have Liz Cheney or whatever in my cabinet. And I was like, what an insane answer. And all of the data is bearing that out. So if Kamala loses, a lot of it will come down to not only the economy, but the inability to truly distinguish herself from Joe Biden, the presidency, the administration, and to draw a contrast with Donald Trump.
I've been a little hesitant to opine on this because it matches my own political ideologies and beliefs a little bit too closely, right? Of like, oh, guess what? You stopped talking about price gouging and started talking about Liz and Dick Cheney, and your polls are moving in the wrong direction. Gee, who could have predicted? You know, at the beginning of when she comes in, there were a few very clear things she needed to accomplish. Number one, she needed to separate herself from Joe Biden. I mean, this has been beyond obvious from day one because he is very unpopular and people were very unhappy with how the economy was under him, predominantly because of inflation. So she needed to figure out a way to separate from him on the economy specifically, but also in another area where he's very unpopular, and it was where it's a big problem with the progressive base, on Israel and Palestine. She has been totally unable, even at this point, to figure out how to message on that, how to actually create some distance, not just rhetorical distance, but actually create some distance. And people were open to her being different. You know, we've seen polls in the past that said, oh, people actually think she's the change candidate because, you know, it's kind of a vibes thing. She looks and feels different. She's, you know, identity-wise, she's different. Stylistically, she's different. She's from a different part of the country, whatever. She's much, much younger, obviously, than either of these two men. But since she was unable to back up that vibe of change with any substance, here we are, right? Then you roll out some pretty good policies that are really popular, things like the price gouging thing I talked about, you know, the housing policy, and these still come up. So I'm not going to say she doesn't talk about them whatsoever. But the thing they've chosen to lean into the hardest is, I'm going to have Republicans in my cabinet. Here I am. What's that?
Bipartisan.
Yes, here I am campaigning with Liz Cheney. Where's the campaigning with Bernie Sanders, who is profoundly more popular, especially among working class voters, than Liz Cheney is? So they decided to go in that direction. I think their theory was that the problem for Kamala is that people see her as too liberal, when really the biggest problem for Kamala is that people see her as having zero ideological commitments or core. And by doing this whole like pivot to Liz Cheney thing, she's only underscored and exacerbated those problems. Now, I do want to say that there's a lot of assumptions that the polls are going to understate Trump again because they understated him in 2016 and they understated him in 2020. That is certainly possible, but it's not definitive. 2022, they understated Democratic support, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, and we've mentioned on the show before. Many of these pollsters have changed their methodology to try to guarantee, they're very risk averse, to try to guarantee they won't understate Trump support this time. So they are using a different method than they did back in 2020 when you actually had the largest miss. So there's no guarantees about which way the polls, understate or overstate the support. But what you can say for sure about these polls, since we had them up on the screen, 3 national polls, all 3, credible pollsters, that in each instance, the polls have moved away from Kamala Harris. And so if you see a significant shift that is consistent across pollsters where, within that same poll, using that same methodology, it is shifted, you have to feel that that is representing something real. The last point I'll make before we dig into some more of the numbers here is some of these polls have her at like a 2-point margin. There is some indication that Democrats are closing the gap in terms of the disparity between the popular vote and the electoral college vote, predominantly because Trump is winning more people in Florida, which is definitely going to be a red state, in New York, which is definitely going to be a blue state, in California, which is definitely going to be a blue state. So when you win more voters in those states that are not swing states, it does not really matter in terms of, it's stupid, but it doesn't really matter in terms of you becoming president of the United States. So it is possible that a 2-point popular vote victory for Kamala Harris does amount to a narrow electoral college win, but it's right on the bubble for her, assuming that these polls are accurate, which is a major assumption.
Yeah, exactly. So look, everybody, I think the most important point that you just made was about movement within them. So if the assumptions were relatively the same and then you're moving away, that's not the best thing for you. And especially like you were just talking about with the popular vote, I can go ahead and pull that up and just take a look at it. So yeah, right now, Nate Silver has her at a D victory with 2.8% of the popular vote. When things start to go a little bit underneath that or in a tie territory, that is when you get to that scenario. So it's not as big as it used to be. Let's also put A3, please, up on the screen because this was a really important point. Red alert for the Harris campaign. In the ABC poll out this morning, 59% of U.S. adults say that the economy is getting worse. More than twice as many saying that it is getting better. Let's go to the next one because CBS News also reflected this, not only in the 51-48, but really also in the battleground at 50-49. Remember here that the margin of error is some 2.3 points. This is also important because this is actually a likely voter poll. It says Donald Trump is 1 point closer to Kamala nationally than last month, and the decisive battlegrounds remain effectively even. So even just puts you an error away from losing. And just generally, one of the very difficult things about this election is actually in the sprint to election day, there is not a single flagship tentpole moment that will happen in the next 22 days that is not controlled by the campaign, as in there will be no debate, there will be no, there will be no like major event that some 60, 70 million people are going to watch. Like traditionally, actually right around now in mid-October is when that third debate usually happens on foreign policy, and then you have the sprint there. We're going to have some media style events, town halls, etc., but none of those will ever have the same reach. So actually, one of the reasons why Kamala is uniquely vulnerable, in my opinion, is that the global system is very unstable right now with the Iran war situation, and being tied to that, being tied to the status quo, and also just being tied to a general feeling of chaos in the world. If that were to really break through and take over the airwaves, that's very dangerous. She's also uniquely has a problem. Let's say that there is major movement in the stock market for reasons that have nothing to do with her or even with the, with national policy. It doesn't matter. People are really going to make up their minds on election day. So you and I were talking in 2016, a decent part of the electorate, especially in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin broke, I think it was like 14% of people made up their minds just in the last couple of days before the election. It's not going to be that high. It was 8% in 2020. Let's say it's 5. I mean, 5 is the margin of victory, actually. So for a lot of these people, so you're really leaving yourself up to unique macro conditions of which you have no control whatsoever. And that is why, this is really an issue where she's not even really banking on the economy anymore. It's just all abortion all the time if you look at all of the swing state polls. And I think she's in a very vulnerable place. I'm not saying she can't win. She absolutely could. But if she does, I think it'll be very, very narrow, especially compared to the Joe Biden victory or even Obama or, something like 2012 and 2008 previously. So it really is tough. It's not, I think the landscape is definitely not good for her right now.
Here's what I would say is that, do I think she would be doing better if she leaned into, the top concern of voters, which is economics, on which she has popular policies? I think, we had a whole debate about Trump's tariff policy, but her line about Trump's tax and really hammering home that his policy will raise prices for consumers. Do I think she would be doing better if she was hammering that every single day? Absolutely, no doubt. But I also have to say, it's possible the campaign she's running will be enough because it was in 2022 and I didn't think it would be. This is effectively the campaign Democrats ran in 2022 where they thought, hey, we can get together this, bipartisan anti-Trump coalition and not really run on the economy at all. I mean, they did not talk about the economy really at all in 2022 or Biden in 2020 for that matter. He did not run on specific policy proposals with regard to the economy in the general election in 2020. So in 2022, the playbook was democracy, abortion, their extreme, and it was enough. It was enough to forestall a predicted red wave, what the polls were all showing. At that point, the economic numbers were far more dire than they are right now. I mean, that was really at the peak of inflation. You were just coming off of all of the unhappiness over COVID lockdowns and that whole fight. So the landscape in 2022 was actually a lot worse in a lot of ways for Democrats than it is now. And the, hey, abortion plus extremism message was sufficient to buck historical trends, to win the Senate and to come very close, actually, in the House. So I can't say confidently that it won't work, that it won't be enough. It might. It may well be enough. Democrats did well. They lost in 2016, obviously, even though they, it's worth pointing out, they did win the popular vote there as well. But they did well in 2018. They did well in 2020. They did well in 2022. So, I think the certitude that many have right now that Kamala Harris is 100% going to lose, I just would have some humility about the predictions at this point, because we've seen so many different iterations and polls be off in so many varied ways over the course of the past decade.
Very important. And, unlike, I see so much poll triumphalism out there.
Yeah.
I am amazed by it. I'm like, how many of you were saying red wave back in 2022 and you just look like an idiot afterwards? I mean, you have to do some serious soul searching. I've been burned 2016, 2016, 2020, and 2022. Those are like the three biggest polling errors I've seen just in my professional career.
Yeah.
So I have no idea how you could do this for a living and then tell people with a straight face that you're going to have the exact same polling errors you did in 2016 and 2020. Absolutely stupid. You should unfollow anybody who is telling you that. Let's put this on the screen too, because this is actually central to why I am so skeptical still and still remain in the 50-50 camp. Whereas if I didn't, I would just be like, oh, I think Trump is going to win. Nate Silver talks here about how, quote, New York Times polls are betting on a political realignment. What he talks about specifically is that the 2020 electorate substantively is very different than the 2022 electorate, which dramatically swung independents towards Democrats. Key features of the 2022 midterm race. Yes, I know it is different, but it has some interesting things that we need to carry over. Number one, midterms had the same Republican advantage in terms of voter identification. More people identified as Republicans. However, didn't end up mattering. Why? Because independence broke dramatically for the Democrats. Number two, you have the same white college-educated swing of these highly engaged voters who came out hard for the Democrats, donated a ton of money, had a ton of political enthusiasm, at the same time that you saw the inklings of what happened in 2020, where you had Latino and Black men specifically shift towards the Republicans, but it was not enough to put them over. So one of the reasons why the New York Times polls are so different than others is because they are not doing the same thing that many others are doing, which is trying to compose their polls as being exactly reflective of the 2020 electorate. That's why you see a lot of them in the way that they are, and why the New York Times is so different, for example, on Florida. One of the reasons why I do kind of buy their thesis is Trump only won Florida by 3 points. What's he going to win it by this time? Minimum, in my opinion, 6 to 8, right? He could win it by 14. They have him up by plus 13. So if anything, I would bet on a Republican wave there. That is very important because that tells us that the same voter characteristics of 2022 are going to try and carry over here. And the country has changed so much. I want everybody to try and to think about who you were in the year 2020. Sounds crazy, but I was going to watch old videos of myself. It's a different person, literally, completely different. And even in the way I talk and the way I look, everything. Everybody's like that, especially in terms of your political evolution. Also in terms of this election. Logan made such a great point in the last time that we talked to him. And he was like, 2020 is the last time is one of the only elections, only since when wars were involved, where the government had a direct impact in everybody's lives, from state, local, from vaccines to the bailouts. I mean, there's so much stuff that was going on.
Yeah.
Now we're kind of, things are a little bit different now, especially on the economic front, even in terms of people's expectations. And also, Roe versus Wade was the political earthquake that changed things completely, and it reshaped the entire way that entire generation, really, of especially of women, but some college-educated men too, of the way they think about politics. So when I put all that together, I just can't bet on having the same electorate as last time around. It doesn't make any sense to me. So I am betting a little bit on this, realignment. And I think come election day, we're going to see a major mistake by some pollsters. Now, I'm not saying Kamala will win, because the realignment can go Trump way too. You've got him winning. We're about to talk with Nina Turner, black voters by 78%. In the past, if Democrats didn't win black voters by, any more than 15, they're going to lose the entire national election. But they made up a lot of white voters, so you could still definitely get your way there. But I just want people to really caution and think about how much things have changed in the last 4 years and why you really shouldn't look to the previous one.
I'm fairly persuaded by the Nate Cohn analysis too, because it just makes more sense. And it also helps to explain some of the variation between pollsters as well. But like the New York Times polls, so nationally they found it effectively tied. Pennsylvania, they had Kamala with a 4-point lead.
Yeah, right.
And, basically Pennsylvania is the ballgame, effectively. That's what both campaigns think if you look at the likely tipping point state. I mean, just because it is such a swing state and because it is so evenly divided and because it has such a large number of electoral college votes ascribed to it, Pennsylvania is effectively the ballgame. And what they're saying is, if you guys remember in the 2022 midterms, overall, the red wave did not materialize. But there were a few exceptions. Florida and New York in particular. And there may have been a few other states, but those were the two main ones that really shifted. The red wave was there. I mean, what did DeSantis won by double digits? And
20-something
Florida,
points,
all kinds of swing district Democrats were swept down in the state of New York. In fact, if New York had performed for Democrats the way the rest of the country did, Democrats actually would have gained control of the House. It's just because of the red wave actually showed up there. And there are a lot of indications, if you look at the congressional polling, the congressional level polling, that you're shaping up to a similar electoral phenomena where New York, I think those, swing district Democrats in New York are in trouble. I think in Florida, Trump is going to do very, very well and exceed his past vote. But some of the other states don't necessarily look as clearly in that direction. In the same year when Ron DeSantis wins Florida by double digits, John Fetterman won Pennsylvania by a very clear margin, and the governor of Pennsylvania, Shapiro, he won by double digits. So, if you think about not only where everybody is from a political ideology perspective, but if you also just think literally of where people live now, there was a huge migration during and post-COVID that, hadn't shown up yet in 2020. So even that makes things really different. The last thing I'll say is Matt Iglesias made this point. I think it's one that's important to keep in mind in terms of the realities of the American electorate. It is still an overwhelmingly white electorate. So even if Republicans pick up, 10 or 15 points among black voters, if Democrats improve 2 points with white voters, 2 points, then they still win. So that's why you should just have a lot of humility as you're looking at these results. It could really go either way still. It is still very close. I think it's a very closely divided country. And, it's possible we get some new polling error that had not been foreseen previously. And I do think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of these pollsters, because they're so terrified, understandably, of getting it so wrong as they did in 2020. Remember, there were polls coming out of Wisconsin that was like, Biden's going to win by 16 points or whatever.
Famous, 17 points in the state of Wisconsin. Nuts.
Right.
Yeah.
So they're terrified of that happening again. So effectively what they've done is to kludge a way that ties their polls very closely to what the result was in 2020, so they won't get burned to the extent that they did last time. I think that does probably minimize the error, but that doesn't mean that they're getting it right here either.
Exactly right. Could underestimate Democrats, as a lot of them did back in 2022. So we'll see. It's a fun mental game.
It's gonna be interesting.
It's also, what I love about it is I just love the fact that America is still such a dynamic country. People can vote different 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 2 years ago. It validates, everyone is always like, oh, nothing matters. Everybody just votes exactly the same. It's just not true. We're actually seeing a rise of more split ticket voters than ever before, which I think is a great thing, actually very healthy for the country. There are a ton of Mastriano Oz voters, of Oz Shapiro voters who are out there. There are a lot of people out there who will vote for Donald J. Trump for president and will vote for Ruben Gallego for senator. There are a lot of people who will vote for Bob Casey and for Donald Trump in the state of Pennsylvania. And I honestly think that's good. I think it's a good thing, no matter which way, these things all go, because that tells you can't just take these people for granted. All these vote R people, that was kind of the rule of politics from 2010 onwards. We're really seeing a new rise of a lot of split ticket voters. It makes it much harder to predict, but in general, people have to vote. People have to actually fight a little bit harder for your vote rather than assume, oh, these yokels are just going to come out and pull a lever for me.
We're about to talk to Nina Turner more about race and politics and what Obama had to say to black men in particular. But I also think it's very clear that, like, the Democratic assumption that black people could just be pandered to based on, you know, their race and based on a Civil Rights Act that passed, you know, before either of us were born, right? I'm not going to try to do the math in my head because that'll just be embarrassing. But, you know, that just playing to their racial identity would be sufficient, or that just playing to the racial identity of Latinos would be sufficient. And they were wrong about that. And, you know, frankly, this is something we've been talking about for a long time. It's like, you know, talk about black voters or the black community or the Latino community really erases that these are just human beings, individuals with a variety of concerns that aren't really different from whatever my concerns are, your concerns are, your concerns are. And so part of what we're seeing with this racial de-alignment is really a rejection of that very surface level, very hollow pandering style of identity politics. And, you know, we'll see if Democrats ever learn that lesson.
All right, let's bring her in. Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.